Margrethe Vestager, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We
Well,
have
thank you very much. No,
I'm
it's just such a
interested.
pleasure to be here. Well, thank you.
The pleasure is mine. I have offered a long list of questions related to the DMA, how much regulation can do, and how to interconnect Digital Markets Act with other legislation, with other strategic issues of how to build in European digital markets, maturing it. But I wanted to start with expressing my personal and also many other academics gratitude for the work you've been doing over the last years, the last decade and more. It was really remarkable how much competition law and policy has changed, what significant metamorphosis occurred to it, transitioning from technical area to kind of inspirational, world-changing field. At least many are motivated by this big idea in relation to digital markets and beyond. And you've been this leader channeling this message and pioneering this message to across so many different fora. So academic community was really triggered by this idea, and you see, particularly younger generation students and those who are already doing competition law in various fields uh, were privileged to have your voice, and I'm sure your voice will be there in the future. So thank you very much, Margaret, for this.
Well, it's incredibly kind of you to say this. I find it really touching, especially what you say about the students under your leadership, because if you can capture the imagination of the next generation, then you can change things. And I'm not educated within the law. I'm not a lawyer, so I never had the inclination, to try to compete with the magnificent people at DG Comp. My role was different, to say, well, what is it all about, and why is it important that we take upon us these cases? And I have seen, over these 10 years, what a magic combination it can be with leadership, team, and institution. None of these three things can have any effect by themselves, but coming together, the potential for change, I think, is really there. And I think it's really important that competition plays its role in a world that needs change.
Absolutely. And for many people, this embodiment of changes was the new competition tool, and which had its shape in the DMA and DSA. Obviously, DSA has its own life. I wanted to focus to start with discussing the DMA. Perhaps the first question is a kind of, it's too early to judge, and we have different voices, different tonalities are being channeled to all of us in terms of how successful it is, how under-delivering it is, how impossible to deliver in some meaningful changes in such entrenched market is. So different commentators convey different messages. You, as a main architect of the DMA, how do you evaluate it after 2 years of its day-to-day enforcement?
So, as you say, it's early. And second, I think it's really important not to pretend that the DMA was supposed to solve everything, because it was never supposed to solve everything. There will still be competition cases, because from what we have seen, and also the people before me, once you catch one kind of illegal behavior, another kind of illegal behavior will emerge that you have not thought of, that you need to identify, where you need to test your hypothesis, and you need to be willing to be innovative also in your hypothesis, your theories of harm in the marketplace. But I think it's a bit underestimated what the regulatory dialogue actually enables. Because if you see the possibility to carry a second app store on your iPhone, this is one of the, I think, very visible things, and that you see new app stores emerging with different business models. So this idea that you can only judge the DMA on the cases, the decisions, the fines, I think one needs to balance that with what happens, which is very much under the radar, because it is within the framework of the regulatory dialogue. I think that is important. And I think it's also very important to see what role it can play in a market that is changing really dramatically at the same time because of artificial intelligence and because of geopolitics.
Absolutely. And I wanted maybe to revert to the beginning, and we all know the reasons why the DMA was necessitated. There are so many explanations for why traditional ex post competition toolbox is insufficient for this really fragmented and rapidly changing world, particularly in digital markets. We know the narrative, but I wanted maybe to use this opportunity to invite you to maybe to unbox a little bit how I wouldn't say how the children are done, but how the meal has been produced. It was remarkable from the perspective of juristic kind of maturity and intricacy piece, which takes into account so many different elements, strategic elements of kind of projecting in the future possible shortcomings, etc. How coming to the kind of drawing board, how was it designed? The ideas were there. How you have embodied them into the legal text?
As you would know, we have not had one, not two, not three. We were on the fourth Google case when I left Brussels. We've had so many Amazon cases. We had a Facebook case, a Meta case. We had the Apple tax cases. We had the other Apple cases. We had case after case after case, and yet we did not see this market opening. And the harm to the challenger is really big if you cannot get into the market. Once you're in the market, of course, you need to fend for yourself with your business idea, your work ethic, your team, your investors. But what we saw was that this was really difficult, and that harms both innovation and investment. And what had been really painful as well was the fact that while we were doing competition cases, businesses were dying because it takes a long time. Because first and foremost, you need to show that your tools are relevant. You know, if you open an Amazon case, the first thing they'll say is that, oh, but listen, we're just 1% of global retail. How can you ever say that we're dominant? And I think everybody will, you know, intuitively say, yeah, but you're dominant in e-commerce, come on. But that will have to be shown. And it takes a lot of time just to show that your tools are relevant, because, you know, if you're a small guy in the market, if you have no market power, the competition rules will not touch you. So you need to show that you have this market power, that you have this dominance before the rules kick in. So we had seen this, that because it takes a long time, and it has to take a long time, because if you're not thorough, you'll lose your cases in court. You know, just poof, the judges, they will throw you out of court. So we were thinking, listen, we need to figure out a way to restart competition here. And then we had sort of the soundings about the new competition tool, which was actually a much more sort of structural tool, and trying to, you know, before illegal behavior was actually identified and you would have a case and a potential fine or settlement or whatever, that you could sort of say, listen, you need to change your behavior, because otherwise your market, it will just, you know, set in stone a behavior that makes it less and less dynamic. There was a lot of back and forth in the consultation process. Some said, no, this is too much. Others said this is too abstract. Some say this is too little, because you're not suggesting that fines could be imposed. And with all that input, we thought, well, then let's make something that is directed towards the most important market that we have, and that will shape future markets in all neighboring markets as well, the digital markets for a number of digital services, and then sort of say that, listen, let's restart. Let's say that from the beginning, we label you gatekeeper, which means that our rules applies to you. So that long period of time when you have to define the relevant market to see if your competition rules actually apply, you can sort of restart that. And we had thought that exactly because it's about the market and because we see so many unfair trading practices, that it is indeed relevant to build this on the legal basis of the single market. And that was the start to say, listen, we need to fast forward and define what is market power, and because of that, label you gatekeeper. And then you know from the very start of the week, so to speak, what are the rules that apply to me. And a lot of people got very enthusiastic about this, and you saw actually how fast and how engaged, especially the European Parliament was.
Absolutely. And this leads me to the question about the potential which the DMA allows for the enforcer varies. So you can apply it conservatively, but you can, if you expand the imagination, the legislators, the co-legislators have given to the DMA team a kind of a missing trump card. If the gatekeepers can play the whack-a-mole game, continuously circumventing, even with Article 13, saying, okay, we did comply. What do you mean we didn't comply? That's our report, etc. Delay, 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 enjoying the status quo, or rent-seeking further the status quo. The DMA team has received a trump card with this kind of veil of vagueness, serving, when the burden of proof is on the gatekeepers, serving the benefits or the position of DMA team. If this is the case, this is hypothetically possible, at least if your imagination is kind of limitless. If this is the case, do you think that there is a potential to look at compliance not as an end in itself, but as a means to kind of to shape competition in digital markets strategically, or it would be a little bit too frivolous interpretation of the DMA, and we have to constrain ourselves to the limits of the letter of law and look at compliance with all the catalog of articles 5.7 as the end game?
Well, for me, the original idea was not sort of a to the letter compliance, because it's a landscape that is being described with the different prohibitions and obligations that should change the marketplace, make it contestable, make it open. And this is why it has this sort of latch that you can actually put in new behaviors and say, well, we have registered this, it doesn't really work. And that is to make sure that the landscape doesn't have, potholes or places where competition disappears anyway. What I think is really important in these first years is, of course, to make sure that you give body and spirit to the articles that we have already. Because I think even though Parliament and Council was very careful to make it very clear what was meant, once a piece of legislation meets real life, it turns out that what was thought of as a very, very clear wording might not be that clear. Because then you get into the weeds and the back and forth and the forth and back, and you need to have the experience as to what is the zone where this article apply and what does it mean in real life. And I think it's really important for the future effectiveness of the enforcement that you allow yourself to have that time to explore what does this actually mean in real life, what is the zone in which this article actually has its meaning.
And so I'm alluding to the question of a broader strategic kind of, we all from year one, all students of law know this, that even the most categorical rule is interpretable. If the stakes are high, it's quite elastic, and you can problematize even the most self-evident, clear-cut, unambiguous and short statement, let alone complex legal text, which is accompanied by other legal texts which still coexist with the DMA. So I'm thinking about the using the DMA as a means to kind of to contribute to the broader digital sovereignty or digital resilience agenda. The commission deciding in college, you know it better than anybody else, obviously has to consider different interests simultaneously, or at least bear in mind different interests. So we don't pursue competition policy in isolation or insulation. How does it look in real life?
Mm, well, as you say, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I have come to admire the profession as one of the most creative ones. Because nothing is possible until it's possible. Because as you say, then the context changes, and that, you know, shines a new light on a wording that was interpreted in one way before, but now can be interpreted in a different way. So I have come to admire that in the legal profession. But I think it's really important to be loyal to the aims of the DMA. Because if you take a tool and you say, yeah, it was created for a different purpose, but now we have a completely different agenda, I think you take away the underlying legitimacy. And it's enough to fight for open and contestable markets. If the DMA can play its role and enable that, work well done. Because that is the foundation for innovation, investment, for consumers and businesses having choice. And that has so many positive side effects, like resilience, for instance. If you're dependent on one supplier, well, if that supplier fails you, what do? Competition will give you more suppliers to choose from. That will give you resilience. So you don't have to venture out from the specific aim of the DMA to be useful in the time that we live in.
Absolutely. That it sounds almost poetic to me. However, if you look, not however, and yet when we look at real life, at Europe's global core players in this Champions League zone, primarily United States, China, are the large, huge jurisdictions, agenda setters, and many of them and often play this kind of Machiavellian game of playing competition with one hand and using some steroids or other prohibited injections using their other hand. Obviously, they have much more homogeneous market, and they can use different toolboxes more coherently. The European Union doesn't have this privilege yet, at least. We are not enjoying single market. And so my question is, don't the belief in competition, in opening markets for their own sake, allowing the next generation of innovators to take over the position of the entrenched players, sounds like idealistic and perfect to me. And yet at the same time, others play by different rule books, probably. Is it the case?
But I think it's also a mind game. To give you one example, somebody told me recently that Revolut, so this new banking business, they have a valuation of maybe 20 billion euros or dollars. There are 6 European alternatives. They do the same or better, also neobanking. But they do that within the framework of individual member states. And the total valuation of these companies is less than 1 billion. And I think that the point I want to make here is that I think Revolut started to say, we want to be a global company. Employee one said, this is going to be a global company. I think very often in Europe, you say, this is going to be a Danish company or a German company. So we need to do two things at the same time, push for the one Europe, one market, but also to push our imagination to say, listen, as from day one, this is a European company, and from day two, it's a global one. And this is why this idea about being EU incorporated is really important to push that. Because the DMA should play its role, but it cannot create the market. And it can only contribute to the change of mindset to say, okay, I have a fair chance of getting into that market. This is why I will invest all my time and all my funds and subscribe my family and what have you actually to do this. And I think it's important for that picture to come together. I've been working with the supply side of social platforms. They don't know of one another. They are not organized. They don't even have a business organization. The supply side is almost invisible. So when the demand side is emerging, because more and more people say, oh, I want an alternative to do my shopping on Amazon. I want an alternative to do my Google search. I want an alternative to WhatsApp. And they are looking, but the supply side doesn't present itself to say, well, listen, this is the place to go. If you want an alternative, not only is it European with all the good things that comes with that, it's also better. And I think that's the push. And the DMA is the basic of that, but the push is something that needs to come from business, from NGOs, from politicians to say, listen, let's make this market happen.
And probably a large role in this process would play procurement, public or private procurement. Do you think there is a potential for us to kind of to adjust procurement, national procurement rules in a way which would somehow bear in mind that buying European in one shape or form or another is kind of playing by the rules of all other jurisdictions, which give priorities, preferences to the domestic local products in most of the cases, perhaps?
Well, I think a lot can be done just by telling what it is that you really want. For instance, in public procurement, that you don't want US jurisdiction on your data. I think that's a completely legitimate criteria. That will lead to that you are having your data stored with European cloud providers that are outside of US jurisdiction. Because also when US cloud providers have their cloud facilities in Europe, they will still be within reach of US jurisdiction. So it will be a long and complex debate about this made in Europe or made with Europe or made for Europe or whatever. And while we are having, while we are having that debate, I think it's important to say, well, I will put my money where my mouth is. This is what I'm asking. And then I want to see who comes with an offer. I don't know. It may be that some of the US companies, they want to divest to be a truly European company. What do I know? And that may be relevant. But the point is to say, listen, this is what I want. Because I want to say to my users or my citizens that when I, with your consent, store your data, the US government cannot get hold of it.
And money helicopter in Europe doesn't have this opportunity of outspend US and China, as you noticed in one of the recent interviews, and thus we cannot compete in terms of offering most favorable conditions for our domestic innovators and scalers, hyperscalers. What would be our solution in addition to what you have just highlighted?
So since I really don't think that we can outspend. So we need to smart spend, so to say. And for instance, as one example, I got to know a company called Flower AI. What they do is that they enable you to develop AI with a distributed network of compute power. You know, in the US, they found ways to build enormous uh, data spaces, enormous facilities. And the idea of Flower AI is to say, listen, I can enable you to use these 10 different facilities at the same time, which will give you what you need in order actually to develop your technology. And I think that's a very good example. But the thing is that, for instance, in a business or in a public service provider, I think it's really important to think about what is the price that you're paying, because very often you will pay the same price, only if it's cheap and foreign provided, you may pay a risk premium that is much bigger than what you will pay with someone who's local, who is born with living up to European rules and who's innovating with a European perspective. Then the risk premium will be much smaller. So I think it's really important to have a view of that. Well, what is it that can happen here? With when we say that we don't want to pay that risk premium anymore because it has been triggered. We have seen how our dependencies, and what we're talking about here is our technological dependency on the US. We also have a technological dependency on China and on Taiwan, but that's a somewhat different story, even though, of course, Chinese companies are also within the space of the DMA. So I think that view of the world is a real change rather than a change in specific procurement rules.
It makes sense. Final question on this. If you look at core platform services, again, from the perspective of the DMA, we see that some of them are deeply entrenched, and opening them up is, if not futile, is quite. So there is always winner takes all. It's like almost zero sum game. If you want to decrease market power of one platform, you probably it will be replaced by the others. Others have opportunity, at least for some limited competition. So I imagine it's hard to expect having more than one or two search engines, kind of in the mainstream consumer mindset, and it's much more plausible to have more probably social media or a little bit more. As an example, do you think we have to look at the markets which are deeply entrenched and expecting some Cinderella stories of startup imagine in a dormitory somewhere in Copenhagen, in London or Berlin, and then outcompeting the super heavyweight giants who know who hoover up all the possible competitors? Or we have to focus on the markets which are less entrenched, where the opportunities for European champions perhaps are more plausible.
Well, I think we have to do more than one thing. I think we need to do several things at the same time because part of the big tech business model is also to condition us to think that there are no alternatives. You know, we are being sort of schooled to think that this is the only good search engine. And with AI on top, it's the only good search engine. This is the only way a phone can look like. We're sort of being conditioned into thinking about this. And I think also with choice screens and what have you, it's very difficult to break that conditioning to say, well, but this is my habit. This is what I have been told for so long that this is the only thing that will really work. And this is why I think it's really important in other markets that are not so entrenched to show people, to have, you know, first movers to say, well, listen, I'm here. I don't need the offering of big tech in order to do what I want to do. And let that experience sort of go through to say, well, I can actually do something else. And also, of course, for new sectors to learn from what has happened. When you look at how the news sector or the publishing sector has been eaten by big tech, I think there are lessons to be learned from other content providers. That be music, that be sports, that be other types of content. That if you're not really careful, well, then the data created by, for instance, streaming this content, when you license it, they will not be yours anymore. Because I think that is one of the lessons of the publishing sector. All of a sudden, they lost the direct connection with their subscribers. They lost their advertising revenue. They basically lost their business model because they didn't think about this. Now we have this experience. Other content providers, they need to learn from this in order to maintain that they have a business model, because they have a relationship with subscribers or fans or customers, and they have the data needed to keep developing what it is that they're doing. And here, of course, the DMA works as a backstop in Europe. They don't have this in the US. But it works as a backstop in Europe because you have the obligation to share data, you have the obligation that you cannot self-preference. So in Europe, you have a backstop, and that, of course, is making the negotiation power somewhat bigger in a European framework than it would be in the US. And I think that is important. That experience is actually really there, and also because, talking about the publishing sector, they are being pushed to rethink their business model once again, because with AI search, the blue links completely disappear. Why would people go there? So traffic is thinning out, which means that whatever advertising revenue they had beforehand will be thinning out as well. And that is a fundamental crisis if you do not have independent content creation.
And it's remarkable how, if you look at retrospectively, such a powerful industry has allowed being somehow completely outperformed by newcomers emerging out of nowhere so quickly. Such tycoons, media tycoons, have had all opportunities to create this machinery of online advertising themselves, and yet they failed this. Now they want obviously to restore at least some, and they are most active, most eloquent, and most convincing as vertical as business users in the DMA discussions. Of course, we have other examples how as well. My next question is about your communication with different stakeholders. It's maybe you can share with us your kind of mental health life hacks. You continuously engaged, having such an important role with variety of people from your team having different views with within the College of Commissioners and staff, etc., with such powerful defendants who are always in continuous dialogue in one way or another with you. How do you keep under control all these kind of trajectories of your daily functionality as such top tier politician and enforcer?
So, one of the things that tells you if people are genuine, for instance, if you have a competition case and they want to settle, is how they treat people. Because very often, they will be very polite towards me as the commissioner for competition, but they would give my team a really hard time. That is not acceptable. If there's something that you don't like, you can tell it to me, but you need to treat my people in a fair way. Because otherwise, because even when you are opponents, we're the law enforcer, you're the business, you need to have a respectful relationship. Otherwise, everything breaks down. So that, of course, I have been signaling whenever, if there has been issues, to say, listen, I cannot deal with you if you cannot deal with my team. The second thing is, but I think this is for everybody in leadership, and people have different ways and means, but I think it's really important, not just to think about your strategy or the future of work in the shower in the morning. You need to make some space for yourself. And for someone like me, in order to think strategically about my work, sometimes I need to do something else. I need to run, I need to cook, I need to knit. In other words, I need to have a life because otherwise I sort of lose perspective as to what is this about. And that, muscle of perspective, I think is really important because, for instance, if you have been in very difficult negotiations and at long last you found an agreement, then you know all the nitty-gritty where you think, oh, we didn't get that perfect. It wasn't exactly how we wanted it to be. You have to sort of whoosh, leave that behind and see what you got and say, wow, this is a good result, no matter sort of the calculations in between. And I think that muscle of being able to change perspective is something that you exercise by not being completely consumed by your responsibility and your work.
Continuing on this level of behavioral or communications, I wanted to ask you once said that each big tech has its own difficulties and charms, which is very telling in a way. So obviously we know that the DMA is a continuous process of communication between the gatekeepers and the DMA team. It's not one-off ad hoc exercise of ex post. It's eternal, I imagine, process for them. So it looks at the level of psychological, subjective, personal charm and idiosyncrasies between different players play an important role. Maybe you can reflect how different do you observe significant differences in terms of how the DMA or competition cases are being reflected by the main players and maybe do's and don'ts in this exercise.
Well, I agree that they are very different. They have a different business culture. They have different aims. They have a different history and they compete with one another. I have once been in Silicon Valley. I was there to give a speech, and then I thought, well, I'll go see some of them. And first, we visited the Apple headquarters. And you have to, leave your car. There will come a golf cart and take you to a very big fence. There's a park around it. It's a beautiful park. They do not have mountain lions because of lack of water. And then you're sort of taken on these sort of, path towards that gigantic oval building in beige marble and glass. That is, it's perfect in its shape. It's completely self-contained. When you get in, the hallway is the entire height of the building, and you have trees. Later the same day, we visited Google. They had works outside of the building, roadworks. You could kind of parse them. It would be a bit muddy. When we come in, it looks as if they decorated it from IKEA, which is perfectly fine. It's just for you to sort of mentally see the difference. Um, the building was not, it seems as if they had been expanding over the years. And on the way to the meeting room, you see some of the handwritten charts that they had done from the very beginning when they got started as a search engine. So I think this tells you something about how different they are and how different they see themselves. And I think that is important, that you can dial in and out of those different cultures as a team of enforcers. That being said, they are still faced with the same standard. The law is the law, no matter your culture. Well, if this is what we expect of you, this is what we expect of you. It's not your charm or your culture that can give you a lighter compliance obligation.
And what also is perplex, or it's the fact, but it's still very interesting that these companies pay each other billions for some loyalty, etc. And at the same time, they fiercely compete with each other on different markets. So this divide et impera is probably one of the guiding rules for the enforcer. You probably have to somehow use this inter ecosystem competition energy to instrumentalize them for the purposes of broader European public policy interests. And for this, obviously, we need some knowledge of nitty-gritty. Engineers have to, computer engineers, software engineers must understand the technicalities because they outperform us by many zeros. Do you think it's doable? Do we shorten the gap, the knowledge gap between the technology leaders and enforcers?
Well, I think one of the very encouraging things that I experienced was that when we started in that, people came knocking on our doors and say, "We want to be part of this." I work there, I made 10 times as much, whatever. I want to be part of this. You know, this idea that this really gives you purpose. And so many different organizations, they say, we want to help. From the very first day, I said, it will take a community to make this actually happen. It's not just a question of enforcing with blinders. You need to do the enforcement job, but others need to help. We need data. We need your experiences. We need to know what you see, because otherwise we will not know the market so intimately as we need it. Second point, we have so many brilliant entrepreneurs in Europe, amazing people. The point for them is that the least we can do is to provide them with one market and capital that will allow them to scale. If we don't, well, what are we asking for? So I think we learned in the first wave that when you have a market, then you can jump the Atlantic and you can capture the European market as well. So we need to learn from our own omissions and do better this time. And the second thing is that we just looked away or shrugged our shoulders, I don't know, when all the verticals became integrated. And I think that was a major mistake, because if you're dominant and you start integrating verticals, per definition, you makes it very, very difficult for other verticals, because already then you had sort of some of the characteristics of infrastructure. And now we have the same with AI. We see that some of the AI companies, they basically want to be the internet. They want to be the gate that lets you in, and then you will do your different things with those with whom they partner up, or where they themselves develop a service. And I think it's really important for competition enforcers of the day to have a look at this, because otherwise it will be so entrenched in a very, very short time frame.
This is my last question. It's probably a repetition of what I have asked earlier, because you just put your finger exactly on the problem. It looks to me that we simultaneously deal in Europe with two existential challenges. One, we want to make the digital world, a better place, make it kind of not necessarily like internet of the 90s where people were discussing freely things on forums, but at least kind of less ecosystem. So where you use one ecosystem, you are completely served physically and virtually, and in the future, obviously, with AI, you will be like in Jeremy Bentham's world, you will all your sensors will be satisfied completely. So there will be no opportunity for you to exit and no desire. So this is a fundamental global humanistic challenge. And at the same time, it looks that it's the dynamic within or the trajectory, the direction in which the internet is evolving or mutating or developing, let's say. So we need to maybe to develop rather than only trying to stop this process, stop the clock ticking. Probably we have to assist our companies to take over this crucial places because that's the fourth industrial revolution, whatever the industrial revolution, without having infrastructure, without having data as new oil, we're doomed to play in the second category, etc. We are still sitting on the previous achievements of our own big guys, perhaps. Is it too cynical, or how do you reflect upon this?
I think it's a very complex and difficult question. When we had the first industrial revolution, what is that, 150 years ago? We're still cleaning up after that. It has taken us so long. First they got the kids out of the factories to send them to school. Then adults got more reasonable working hours. Then adults got protection from things that would give them cancer. Then we realized, oh my God, nature is not, it doesn't work. You cannot just pour your poison into the water or bury it in the sand. It has taken us so long and we're not done. On the contrary, global warming and what have you. And I would really want the world to learn from this, to say, listen, you cannot wait till you see the effects. You need to say, well, the fundamentals, they are the same no matter the technology, that people have rights. They should be, have their rights over their data, their time, and they should be protected against the things that will conditioning them into addiction, or that will prevent them from using their talent, launching their business, and scale it if they have the talent to do that. So I think it's really important what we do now. And this is why the fact that Europe has legislated, we have laws. I think that enables you to talk with the rest of the world, not for them to do the same, but to figure out what we do. So, for instance, within the framework of the extended G7, you have the Hiroshima process led by the Japanese. It's a voluntary scheme, but still, it's a pathway to get there. You see how the American population is getting more and more concerned. They're playing catch up with what Europeans have been thinking for a very, very long time. And I think that's the real revolution. That is when politicians realize, oh my God, it's not my relationship with BigTech that's important. It's my relationship with my citizen and them as voters that's important. That is the real change that we need, because we have all the experience, we have all the learning, we know how to regulate infrastructure. We know how to regulate monopolies if they have to be there, because you can have a monopoly, but not if it's not regulated. And I think it's that sort of opening of minds that we need for the next month, not years and years and decades, but the next month and coming years, for us to realize that if you want a dynamic world economy, well, then it needs to be open.
This is the message and the energy which we start missing actually. So my last question before inviting you to provide recommendations to students, which is a must, is to ask about the plans for the second half of 2020s.
Mine? So, well, I'm still in my cooling from the job as commissioner, which means that I'm chairing the board of the Danish Technical University. I have a lot of speaking obligations, and I still try to push these different areas that I am very passionate about. Open contestable markets, technology that's safe to use that actually serves humans, that we get the supply side visible for people actually to choose, for people to put their money where their mouth is. And that can happen in so many different forms and shapes. And then, of course, I have more time for my grandchildren and my children and my husband. And I hope that 2026 will be the year where I get another dog as part of my household, fingers crossed.
We are now dog sitting. We have our own dog and dog sit with a friend's dog, which makes our life much more colorful. So I fully share this feeling.
Yes.
And yet, I believe that this is the first two cadences was just a prelude, and we really hope that we will see you maybe in different shape and form, continue your leadership in this field.
Thank you.
Finally, please offer some maybe recommendation for those who are entering this field of competition policy or law or economics in such a kind of unimaginable times for students.
I always find it difficult to offer advice or recommendations. But when I have been my happiest, it has been when I found something that I was passionate about. And it may not be sort of what was sort of directly ahead of me, because I have always refused, the blinders of a strict career plan. Because, the point of putting blinders on a horse is that it should not be disturbed. It should just do its job. But very often, the interesting things, you see them out of the corner of your eye. And you need to turn and explore to see, is this my calling? Is this what I want to do? And because of that, I think life can be seen more like exploring a landscape rather than getting to one goal. And I'm very inspired in seeing things that way by Jane Fonda, because she said recently, if somebody tells you that you're over the hill, well, it's you who has the new horizon. And I think if you do that when you study law, well, then you can find so much purpose. And remember, law is a very, very creative profession.
Margrethe Vestager, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ideas with us.
It was such a pleasure being with you. Thank you.